Okay, thank you everybody for coming to this panel on a Friday night. This is a panel on anti-fascism. It's a discussion, very timely right now. Just very briefly, we're part of an organization on campus, Platypus Houston. We're part of Platypus. We host reading groups and coffee breaks and regular events like this, usually once a month. That's what we aim for. We're a project dedicated to asking the question of what is a left in the present, what is an emancipatory politics for the present, and so we try to have these discussions as well as print these discussions in our journal, which is free up here at the front, to host the conversation on the left. Tonight's panel description, just before I introduce each of the panelists, I'll read this out loud in my tenor. Since the Nazi seizure of power 80 years ago, anti-fascism has been a component of left-wing politics. In response to the Trump presidency, the politics of anti-fascism, reminiscent of the Popular Front of the 30s or the Black Bloc politics of the 90s, have once again been resurrected by the left. How is anti-fascism the same or different today? Why anti-fascism now? And so just to introduce some of our panelists up here. I'll start with Mark, who's down there on that end. Mark Kazanski, is that right? Kazanski, okay, I was wrong, it's all right. Was born in the Soviet Union, sang songs about Lenin, and emigrated to the US at a young age. After learning about repression suffered by Jewish relatives in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, he paid particular attention to anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and fascist movements in the US and abroad. Seeing firsthand in Moscow how skinhead and fascist movements can seduce sections of the youth, disrupt civil life, and ruin worker solidarity, he became determined to personally participate in the fight against fascism. Mark is a member of Socialist Alternative in Houston. To Mark's left, so our right, Bernard Sampson, native Houstonian, lived a year in the Soviet Union, been a member of the CPUSA since 1977, current chair of Houston CPUSA chapter, precinct chair for downtown Houston, member of DSA, Working America, COCO? The COCO. Okay. Our Revolution and Houston Area Progressives. It's an acronym down here. And then Gloria.
I forgot to send
No
you
problem.
the
Yeah,
information.
just you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Gloria Rubac. I grew up politically in the civil rights movement, such as it was in Oklahoma. And once I got out of college, I got the hell out of Oklahoma. So when people ask me, how can you live in Houston, it's so conservative, I'm like, try Oklahoma. So after the Houston police murdered Carl Hampton on July 26, 1970, he was the head of the Black Panther Party, we wrote all over the country to try to get national support for the people who weren't killed but were charged with attempted murder of a police officer. Workers' World Party, well actually its youth group, Youth Against War and Fascism, was the only national group that answered us. Okay. After things, I joined Workers' World in 1972. I'm now contributing editor to our newspaper and on the Central Committee.
Excellent. And Gus? Tell us a little bit
about thing?
No, I didn't get it.
Oh, I'm sorry for not sitting.
No problem.
I also want to apologize for being late. I'm really, really sorry. I was so embarrassed. But yeah, I'm from Houston. I've been a member of a great deal of groups, but I'm currently a member of Redneck Revolt, and I used to go here, so it's great to be here. And I just want to say thank you for Danny and Platypus for inviting me out.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So the structure of the panel tonight is going to be about 10 to 12 minutes of presentation, sort of opening remarks by each panelist. Then we'll have about 3 to 5 minutes of responses, and the whole rest of the time is for Q&A. So there's a lot of you here tonight, so I'm expecting lots of questions and lots of great discussion. So, Mark, if you would like to start.
Sure. Let me know if I'm talking too quietly or too loudly or too slowly or too fast.
You're great.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about identifying fascism, what it looked like, what it looks like now, some historical fights against fascism, and what fighting fascism looks like now. So there's a distinction between other authoritarian and reactionary movements and fascism. Now, useful working definition of fascism that I found is, the pursuit of a transcendent and cleansing nation-statism through paramilitarism. Now, the nation-statism and cleansing part, that's, focus on eliminating enemies of the nation. So, and when those enemies are, ethnicities or races, the only solution fascists see is killing them or deporting them. So, genocide is just embedded in the movement. It's implied by the ideology. The transcendent part is, seemingly offering an alternative to the left-right spectrum, an alternative to class struggle. The phrase was, Mussolini was going to knock their heads together. That appeals to demoralized working class people, and it appeals to insecure middle class people afraid of losing their status. Also, in Italy, in the early days of the movement, we see people from border areas of Italy, especially those close to to Slavic countries. We see those people overrepresented in the movement. These are areas where borders might be insecure after World War I. The national identity may not be clear, or it might be diverse, and they're feeling threatened. So we see those people overrepresented in the early days of the movement, and we see that now. Paramilitary movements in border states in the U.S., Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, organizing against, organized around actually hunting immigrants, right? It's these militias that patrol the border, and at least in their imagination, they think that the borders are threatened, that their national identity is threatened by immigrants. That's what they're motivated on. And we see people with just fantasies of nationalism and nostalgia for formal white supremacy, explicit white supremacy, outlined in law. And we see these people from all over the country rallying around Confederate statues. People driving in from California and Montana, not Confederate states, but they're still nostalgic about the Confederacy. So, to be clear, fascism is a movement that denies the right of other people to exist, and it has goals of genocide. So this is not an opinion that's to be debated, right? I don't want to look at it, through a liberal lens. Reasoning did not work, and there's no reason to think that it will work now. Right? So the goal is to defeat fascism physically, politically, socially, wipe them out, destroy their movement and ideology, make this movement go extinct. Right? The only thing that's really worth debating is strategy and tactics on how to destroy fascism. So, historically, in 1920 Italy, we had massive workers' occupations of factories. 500,000 workers plus rural people occupying landowners' land. There were, Red Guards prepared to defend factory occupations. There were conditions for revolution. And, because labor leadership, union leaders, were willing to negotiate and collaborate with the state and owners, and, the Italian Socialist Party refused to lead a revolution. The revolutionary moment failed, and what resulted was demoralized workers. And that created room for fascists to, for a reactionary movement to build, and for fascists to take power 2 years later. So in 1922, Mussolini comes to power, and the resistance that the Italian Socialist Party was offered was mostly non-violent, mostly ineffective. There were other, left paramilitaries fighting fascists, But they didn't really have the recognition of socialist or communist parties at the time, particularly effective. Germany also had, left-wing paramilitary movements. They fought fascists before they took power, and obviously a lot of them were banned and persecuted after fascists took power. There's the Iron Front and the Red Front Fighters Alliance. These were associated with the Socialist Party of Germany and the Communist Party of Germany. And they were effective, in slowing down organization on a street level, but they did not really mobilize enough of the working class to make a serious difference. And then after the war, anti-fascist action resumed in Germany, and this was older members of the Socialist and Communist parties of Germany. So it was mostly older members. So it wasn't the sort of youth movement we see now. And they were involved in denazification, hunting down, punishing Nazis. Once again, they didn't mobilize enough of the working class. And they were in conflict with occupying allies who were building parliamentary democracy, capitalism, and very often keeping the old Nazis in positions of power. And eventually anti-fascist action was forced out of the labor movement and was really irrelevant until the 1780s. And then now we see a resurgence in fascist movements. We can trace it to part of it is the modern patriot movement, which we can trace it to the Posse Comitatus movement of the 70s, which was a racist Christian identity movement, anti-Semitic, all sorts of other right-wing politics, and they organized local paramilitaries. Out of that came out the 90s militia movement, which was mostly a rural reactionary movement. And then since 2008, we've seen a huge increase in paramilitaries like 3%ers, Oath Keepers, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Associations, which is a weird one. It's run by a former sheriff, and their claim is that sheriffs are, the highest law of the land. They're the ones who should be interpreting, laws and constitution. And really, all that means is it's a way for cops to ignore civil rights laws. That's what they're about. And then there's, of course, some just outright fascist movements, like like the French New Right and Christian Identity and National Bolshevism, which is awful, and traditional Workers' Party, people like that. And we've seen several confrontations that are we can learn from. And I think like a particularly instructive one was in 2007 in Knoxville, when a group called Vanguard America rallied. It was a regular, sort of racist rally, and it was counter-protested by anti-racist clowns. And they had slogans like, white flower and white flowers and wife power. And, they chanted this at the Nazis and provoked the leader of the rally to attack them. He got arrested, and their rally was shut down. And lots of mockery. That was great, but it's probably not going to be effective anymore. Mockery. The alt-right is immune to mockery, right? The way that they've been radicalized online. Everything is shrouded in layers of irony. So we can't rely on mockery or what Democrats want us to do is just turn our backs. So we're running out of time, but we all know the recent clashes. February, the Berkeley Milo protest, August 11 and 12 in Charlottesville, the Torchlight rally, and then the Unite the Right rally, where people got killed. In both of these, we saw outright fascists organizing. In these cases, in the Milo rally, the speech was canceled essentially after protesters refused orders to disperse, not because of property destruction, as the media would report. In Charlottesville, the Friday event was a small victory for the fascists, which emboldened them. But on Saturday, we saw their tactics fail. Their game of acceptability of marching in seemingly aspirational middle class uniforms of khakis and polos, that failed. And once again, what we saw is that physical force made a difference, right? So anti-fascists were able to protect other activists from violence, and they were able to use strategic violence to send a message to the cops that they can't, they're not in control of the situation. So this use of violence made them shut down the rally, right? It turned a permitted rally into an illegal one. And in that case, that was effective. Boston was an even better result, where we saw massive, 40,000 people turn out to shut down this free speech rally. And once again, we saw that, the Democratic mayor had no plan to oppose the far right. It was, the only plan was to ignore them. I'm gonna skip to the summary. So, right. So what we see from the struggle now is that the Democrat elite have no plans to fight fascism. Right. What does work is mobilizing large numbers of workers, and tactics and strategy matter. Use of force in very specific situations makes a difference. We can also probably talk about weapons. Some of the anti-fascists had guns and weapons, and supposedly as a deterrent against the far right escalating tactics. And I think we can discuss whether or not guns make sense at a protest like this. But if it's a deterrent, it becomes an arms race, and that's something we can't win yet. And we saw an example of this in the Syrian protests when guns became involved, the movement building stopped, and the only people who could get constant supply of weapons were the fundamentalists. So really, our tactics should be mobilizing large sections of the working class. The working class should lead this struggle, because we've got the most to lose and we've got the most to gain. And showing people that they can rally around material interests, fight for 15, Medicare, workplace organizing, making and winning demands. That sends a clear message that it's their material conditions that are in their interest. It's class struggle and not race or nation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good. Where did the Antifa movement begin? I'd like to say in the South, both during the Reconstruction and after, with the beginning of Jim Crow. What is Jim Crow and Southern apartheid other than another form of fascism? Here we have resistance to Jim Crow and the KKK terror in the form of armed groups defending their homes and farms. This form of resistance went on well into the 50s in the South. If anyone's aware of that history, I would say, in my opinion, it's sort of a unique view, but I believe that what took place in the South was an early form of fascism after capitalism capitalism overthrew the South. What we would call the more modern form of the Antifa came from the Communist Party of Germany in the 1920s. The German Communist Party formed a military section of its party called the Red Front. The Red Front had thousands of members all over Germany. They had headquarters in different working class neighborhoods, usually in the back room of a bar where they would meet. Many members of the Red Front were unemployed both because of the Depression and because of their party affiliation. They were organized into fighting units, wearing uniforms, and even including their own bands. The Antifa flag today originated from the German Red Front. This is a picture of the German Communist Party headquarters about 1930, before Hitler came to power. And there's the Antifa flag right there. It's the exact same flag that's used today. Most people don't know that. The Red Front battled the brown shirts all over Germany by any means necessary. The socialist-led government finally legally banned the Red Front and closed it down while the Nazis continued their terror campaign. Most people don't know this, but the Communist Party USA formed a New York chapter of the Red Front, which was headquartered on 95 Avenue B. It was headed up by Fred Beale. This was destroyed, the photograph, in the rain recently, but this is a photograph people are welcome to see of the New York section of the Red Front in uniform marching. The banner says, "Fight against fascism, hunger, and war." It says, "Join the Red Front." So a little bit of history that a lot of people don't know anything about. Both men and women were members. I think it changed form after around 1935 to 36 when the party moved from the United Front to the Popular Front. The Communist Party USA continued to fight U.S. Nazis both in the streets and by trying to break up their meetings. When the Spanish Civil War started, the Communist Party raised around 4,000 volunteers in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which went to Spain and fought as part of the international brigades. Over 2,000 died fighting fascism in Spain, which I would say the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was also a form of Antifa. And many of the members that fought at Antifa also joined in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and 40% of the membership was Jewish, mostly from New York, that went into the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and came out of the Antifa movement. All the early anti-fascist organizations in the 1920s and 30s dealt both on the tactical and strategic level. They were very organized in their actions, but saw these in the context of strategic goals. Now, this is one of the big differences. The Antifa movement in the 20s and 30s was organized by political parties, whereas today it's not. And so it makes a big difference. Back then they were tied to the strategic needs of the working class and the strategies that different parties had in fighting capitalism and fascism. What was then called the United Front and later the Popular Front. Antifa and other such groups are today not linked with political parties. They're mostly of a tactical nature and not strategic. While defense against fascists is both a necessary and moral obligation, it needs to be tied to the broader political goals. The fascist movement exists only because capitalism is the system we live under. Fascism will always be there, sometimes lurking in the dark corners and sometimes coming out in the sunlight. To defeat fascism for good, we need to see where it comes from. The struggle against fascism must be combined with the struggle against capitalism and for democracy. The fight against fascism itself can never be one divorced from the struggle against what gives it birth. How do we build unity? First, avoid provocations. The goal of the fascists is to stage provocative acts, trying to get us to respond in kind. In this fight, the state, meaning the police, the courts, and the news media, etc., will always support the fascists. Violence doesn't help build the mass movement we need. Our use of violence is only to defend ourselves. There's a difference between violence and force, by the way, and I'm totally for force at all times. Remember, we must keep our eyes on the main enemy, the capitalist class, not the fascist. You defeat the fascists, you still have the capitalists. Defeat the capitalists, and you no longer have fascists. We must have flexible tactics as well. We must use boycotts, sit-ins, occupations, demonstrations, strikes, picket lines, petition drives, and disruptions. If a law is unjust, we must break it. At this time, the fascist right is still a fringe. They may influence a wider audience, but that audience does not, at this time, participate directly in their actions. You have the fascists banded together as militias and other organizations. The others are still unorganized. They're the ones saying, I'm not a racist, but. Our tactics should differ depending on which group we're dealing with. Many Trump voters can be split from the fascists by involving them in struggle around bread and butter issues that affect their health care, jobs, environment, taxes, etc. But back to the first group, those that are organized. Only in actual war has direct action worked. In all other cases has led to attacks on the left by the capitalists. While brave and admirable, the capitalists use our actions, not those of the fascists, to pass laws that lead to greater repression, not only against the left, but against democracy in general. I've never seen the capitalist state repress the right. Antifa can play a more productive role in the struggle against fascism here in the U.S. It must develop operations both on the tactical and strategic goals. It needs to incorporate itself within the Popular Front movement, which is forming against Trump. This includes the left, organized labor, Black Lives Matter, Native American organizations, Latino and immigrant groups, women and LGBTQ groups, Asian, Jewish, Muslim, and young people and others. Antifa exists today because the capitalist class is in crisis. Some of its far-right sectors are promoting fascism and the destruction of bourgeois democracy. Antifa fills a vacuum where the state will not defend the working class from the terror, and young militants will. That's it.
Today, I mean, you gave a lot of definitions of fascism, but there's really not a pure fascism that we can look at. The actual fascist groups in the U.S. today are pretty small. And one of the reasons for that is there's already an outlet for people who have fascist ideas. You can become a cop. I mean, where is it right now? St. Louis, where people are pissed off because the cops got off from murdering somebody. And I don't know about y'all, but I am so tired of looking at videos on my Facebook feed showing cops just beating the shit out of people and there's no reprisals. So you can have fascist ideas and you can kill oppressed people and you can get paid for it if you're a cop. Look at Charlottesville. The cops stood by while a Nazi fired at anti-fascists and didn't even arrest the shooter. Yet the same cops would have killed a black child with a toy gun or some Skittles. And what about, I can't remember what year, the Greenboro massacre in the late 1970s, when the Klan were allowed to kill members of the Communist Workers' Party and really decimate that organization. The youth group of the party I'm in that was started, I think, back in 1962, was called Youth Against War and Fascism because we saw that war and fascism were the primary tendencies of monopoly capitalism in decline. I'm trying to think. In 1962, the first action of Youth Against War and Fascism was a huge counter-protest against George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of the American Communist Party. He was coming into Manhattan for a speaking engagement, and I guess his intelligence folks found out that there was tens and tens of thousands of people gathering to protest him. He never went across the George Washington Bridge and never spoke. So I think that's one way that you fight fascism. I mean, you can punch a Nazi, I'm not against that. You can do individual things. I can think of a couple of HPD cops I'd like to punch right now. But I think the main way to organize against the Nazis and the right wing and the ultra racist is with mass actions. And if you look at what happened in Charlottesville, like you said, on Friday night, they were marching around like college kids in their khaki pants and white polos and stuff with torches. Now, can you imagine if Black Lives Matter was running around with torches? That would be a mass murder scene. So there's this, it's not even fair to call it unequal, just totally different attitudes. In the early 1970s, Youth Against War and Fascism here in Houston organized a protest outside of a Zionist fundraiser. And I happened to be picket captain. We were walking around picketing. We must have had, I don't know, 20, 30 people outside of this fundraiser. And I told everybody, okay, we're going to go around one more time. And we've been here an hour or so, so we're going to leave. Next thing I knew, about 10 cops jumped on this guy in front of me. His name was Jose Barriga. And by the time I saw his face, it was such a bloody mess. I wasn't sure it was Jose. 12 people were arrested that night. 5 were charged with attempted murder of a police officer for getting the shit beat out of them, and all 12 were charged with aggravated assault on a police officer. I think that was probably the first time I saw the real, and it was interesting. They wouldn't arrest any of the women. This was October 9th, 1973. I was beating this cop with my pole, and he was like, "Little lady, go across the street." Like, fuck you. So things have definitely changed, and now there's equal treatment of men and women, black and white, by the cops when it comes to things like that. It took us a year and a half to organize support for the Houston 12, but we finally won the case. Out of the 12, 8 were Chicano, the other 4 were white. And the first day of the trial, there was so many people there that, well, anyway, a lot of them were elder ladies from Northside who didn't even speak English. They sat in that courtroom every day. And we won. In 1977, I believe it was, the United Nations had this Year of the Woman or something, and there was this huge international conference in Houston at the old Albert Thomas Convention Center. So we had a rally during one of the breaks or something, and next thing we knew, we saw the Klan. Well, let me preface this. We had heard the Klan was going to attack the conference. They had a bookstore in Pasadena back then. Me and another white woman went out and told them that we were U of H students studying something. We were doing a report for a political science class. I don't remember. And after we asked them, we were there maybe an hour, and at first they were eager to tell us all about their despicable politics. But I think the longer we stayed, I don't know if it was looks on our faces or what gave us away, I think they started to realize they're not really doing a report. And we weren't. We were doing surveillance. We drove from Pasadena back to Houston and stopped to get a bottle of wine on the way back. We were so freaked out because they had these dogs sitting there, and they're like, those dogs can attack anybody on command. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm scared of dogs anyway. But okay, so at the women's conference, we knew that the Klan was going to do something because I guess they had hinted at that. So we're having a rally with the Brown Beret women from Austin, I don't know, different people. And here come the Klan down the street with a big banner that says something about no to commies and dykes and somebody, and they had dykes spelled wrong. But they took their banner and they wrapped it around a black woman from Boston who was with us. So the fight began, and we kicked their asses and they left, and we kept their banner. And one other fascist, well, I don't know if y'all remember, but KPFT radio was bombed off the air by the Ku Klux Klan. There used to be an underground newspaper here called Space City News. I was in the Space City office when the Klan drove by and fired shots. So one Easter, I'm thinking it was in the late 80s, the Klan decided they were going to march downtown. This was back when downtown was a big shopping area, unlike today. And lots of people, every bus went to downtown before it went anywhere else. So a lot of people shopped downtown, and I didn't know it at the time, but the Saturday before Easter was the biggest shopping day of the year because every kid's got to get their new little stuff to wear to church on Sunday, I guess. So we organized a coalition to stop the Klan. We were meeting, well, he's now a U.S. congressman. At the time, he was Judge Al Green. We were meeting in his courthouse, which was just a single person building. I guess it maybe had been a house. And that's where we were organizing. The Klan drove by there several times when we were meeting and yelled racist stuff. And we had a very multiracial coalition. Judge Green called us the next morning after one of our meetings and said he found a burned cross in front of his courthouse. I'm like, what are you going to do with it, Judge? He said, I got it sitting right in front of my bench, and anybody that asks me, I'm going to tell me that the Klan was here and burned a cross in front of a courthouse. So these are just some anecdotal things of fascism. I want to talk about Durham because the Workers' World Party members in Durham just recently pulled down a Confederate statue. Takia Thompson, a young African-American lesbian member of Workers' World, climbed up a ladder, put a rope around it, tossed the rope down, and other people pulled it down. So that was pretty cool. A few days after that, Takia and 3 other people got arrested. A few days after that, it was 4 more. I think now they're up to arresting 15 people for 2 felonies and 3 misdemeanors, or maybe vice versa. It turns out that when that statue hit the ground, it crumbled. So one of the felonies is destroying property or something, but it has to be over $200. And we found out these statues were mass produced for super cheap. So I don't think that charge is going to stick because it wasn't worth $200. They went to court this past Tuesday, the first 3. We got a postponement till November. I think the next court date's sometime in October. But I think that the taking down of statues is awesome. And Houston doesn't have that many Confederate statues that I know of. We have Dick Dowling in Herman Park. We've got Columbus on Montrose at that small park. I would love to know where any others are. But I think things like that are cool because you know what happened when Takia and the other 2 had to go in to plead guilty or not guilty? Almost 100 people lined up behind them and said, if you're going to charge them, charge us. So the taking down of the statue was helping build a movement against fascism, and I think that's important. Let's see. How much time do I have?
Like a minute left.
A minute,
Yeah.
okay. I think that fighting, when I was in college, Barry Goldwater ran for president. He was a fascist. He didn't have a party per se, but he was a fascist. In fact, even Nelson Rockefeller called him that. But then, 7 years later, Rockefeller sends in the National Guards to Attica prison and murdered prisoners and guards to stop the siege or the occupation of the prisoners on Attica. So there's a lot of forms that fascism can take. And right now, the neo-fascists and the groups are relatively small, but I think we need to make sure that we keep them small. I think that we do that by organizing. I have to agree with Bernard on this one thing. You got to organize against capitalism, because you can fight the fascists, but if you don't connect it to the material conditions, the economy, and I think have a Marxist view of the state and capitalism, like you said, you can get rid of the fascists, but you're still going to have the capitalist state. So I think we need to use all kinds of things, whether it's taking down a statue, having a meeting like you're doing, or going out and confronting them, whatever you can do. But I don't think we should say that love trumps hate, because it doesn't. A punch in the Nazi's face would trump hate better. And I don't think that we should say, well, they're misguided. They're not. So I'll end with that.
Thank you very much. I will try to take up very little time, or as little time as possible, because I already took up some of y'all's time. And also, I guess I wanted to say as well, I kind of forgot and stuff. I have a history with anti-fascism as well, in addition to the rest of the folks up here. In fact, it was kind of my political beginning. The first protest I ever went to was in a Klan. We came to town in Tomball. Some of us got arrested before we even arrived. But that was in 2005. And so that was my political beginning. That was the first thing that, I was going through a lot at the time, and trying to understand the world in different ways, and being exposed to politics and stuff through punk rock and various different things. But that was the first time that, we wanted to put feet on the ground. And then from there came, kind of organization and whatnot. But we kind of, it took a couple years, took some time, but we came to kind of be critical of the whole tailing Nazis around. And of course, it was a different era. We didn't have fascism didn't have the mass base that it has today at the time, but we began to run up against the limits of what kind of anti-fascism is. So kind of what I want to present here, while I want to draw out the positive in everything, as everybody's been doing with the history of anti-fascism, I want to kind of bring a little bit of critique as well, because I think that the struggle against fascism and the struggle against capitalism have not always run the same course, and have sometimes there's been diversions. I'll get into that. But there's some kind of historical divergences I kind of want to make with some things that some of y'all said here. We can elaborate more on it, but I hope that nobody's offended. But Mark said that we all need to oppose fascism, and we have that as kind of like moral obligation, but that we disagree on strategy and tactics. I think that we also disagree on a number of other things, including the analysis and the methodology of which we view history. Also, I want to say a little bit, I guess, to start out with that. Some things that you said about the history of like Italian fascism and the Italian Communist Party, and the role of the Italian Communist Party in the anti-fascist movement. The formation of the Italian Communist Party out of the Italian Socialist Party, fascism was kind of a central question in that. And I want to say that the anti-fascists in Italy, that were a part of that, really kind of fought their hardest, and they were also pretty significant. I think at that point, the Communist Party in Italy had various different periods of having mass power and whatnot, but that was certainly a period as well. And it still didn't make a difference, because it was like the relationship between liberal democracy and fascists and what they were able to do. Mussolini's march on Rome, he didn't even have to march; he took the train. So we can see these things to their limits, I think. But also. I also agree with everybody else. The only way to really oppose fascism, which is really just capitalism with its teeth bared, is to fight against capitalism. And only communism will destroy the preconditions of fascism. That's really the only way. So I kind of want to be clear on that as well. Mark also said something else I kind of wanted to push back a little bit against, about class struggle, not race and nation. I think that in the American situation, we're we need, I think, a little bit more nuance in that historically revolutionary movements, and if these are the only movements that can just, destroy these preconditions of fascism, historically those movements come out of only particular sections of the working class, which is black and brown folks. So I just want to, I think I want to agree with you, in saying, it's class struggle and not race and nation, because the nation state is what fascists elevate, and I think that's categorically characteristic of fascism. But we're kind of in this kind of weird American situation as well, which I think is just categorically a little bit different than Europe and these movements that we're talking about. Bernard, I definitely appreciate your history of race treason, going back to Nat Turner and everything, of the whole history of rebellion in the United States. I think has almost consistently had a history of race treason, but I don't think that I want to think that categorically the South was not fascism, just because I think that it wasn't necessarily even modern and capitalist enough. I think it was an authoritarian racist regime that I don't know that it benefits us to call it fascism, because I think fascism has particular preconditions and particular characteristics. But Gloria also mentioned, which I think is very true, that the amount at which the definitions vary. One of the best ones I've ever heard, it's very succinct, but it's reactionary modernism. It wants to maintain certain aspects of liberal democracy and the modern world and whatnot, but also wants to be reactionary, wants to recenter things at the base of civil society that it believes once were. So reactionary modernism for me has, it keeps it kind of simple, and that's one way I've heard it understood. I'm glad that you brought up the Spanish Civil War, because I think that's really important if we're talking about fascism. But I want to kind of push back a little bit as well with the history of the Popular Front and the KPD and the SPD just a little bit, because I don't think that the Popular Front strategy worked at all. I don't think that it should be reproduced now. I think that it, in Spain and elsewhere, led the class to the fascist butcher house. And I think in Spain in particular, they had a very advanced revolutionary movement, possibly, one of the most advanced that we've had in the history of humanity. But I think it was really, really something that they had there. And I think that, for those of you who don't know what happened, the Spanish anarchists and Trotskyists, and Stalin. A lot of people like to blame the Stalinists. I don't blame the Stalinists. I blame the class collaboration between the one section of the class, which were the ruling class that were for liberal democracy, wanted to ally itself with the left generally, which was in huge amounts of mass power, in order to oppose the fascists. And I disagree with that strategy, because I don't think that class collaboration will ever strategically destroy fascism or its preconditions, and we don't need to do it. And I don't think that means that we need to let fascism roll over us, at all. But we don't have to sacrifice our principles, our political principles, to oppose fascism. And there's a lot of other things and shortcomings, in the history before, as well, that I kind of wanted to push back against. The KPD didn't, and the Red Front, they didn't just pursue and advance the Popular Front strategy. They also engaged in a lot of what I would call unnecessary factional fights with the SPD and the Communist Workers' Party, which the KPD at the time as well. Other groups doing a lot of work that didn't necessarily need to be fighting each other. So that's a thing that I just kind of wanted to throw out there. And the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, thank you for talking about that. I think that's a really important part of American history. So that was really awesome. But also, what's the capacity of the American Lincoln Brigade to be historically recuperated by the ruling class? We saw John McCain put out this very endearing, I loved reading it, but a very endearing article about a year and a half ago on the Abraham Lincoln Brigade when one of the Abraham Lincoln veterans had died, and it was super endearing and stuff. So what's the capacity of that to be recuperated? And anti-fascism in general, what's its capacity to be recuperated in directions that aren't necessarily ours? And so you also said that anti-fascism fills fills a void. I think that is one way to understand it, but I think creating a void is another one. And I don't mean to say that in a bad way. We can then put things in that void, but I think that in a lot of ways, there's not even necessarily anything that political about anti-fascism. And I'm not opposed to it. And all these things I'm saying, I want them to be endearing critiques. I want anti-fascism to be seen to its end, to be seen to its limits. But I want to reiterate that only a revolutionary movement, against the preconditions of fascism, that's state and capital, is going to, do away with it for good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I could say. I think we're in really phenomenal, really weird times, especially like the fascism that we have. It doesn't lose any of the old-fashioned American white supremacy. We see those alliances as well, but we're also seeing things that we haven't seen before, which is the frat boys and whatnot, and people that look like they're just walking around here and stuff. That were the people in Charlottesville. It wasn't rednecks. It wasn't what we've understood to be racist at all. It's more like kind of has the character of classical fascism, where it's like this movement of this disaffected middle class, which I only believe there's two classes, but believe that we can abstract other ones. The fascists certainly do. I'm done.
Okay. Oh, great. Now we're just going to have responses between the panelists, so just 3 minutes for each just to respond to each other's opening remarks. I guess 3 minutes since we started a little late so that we can get to the Q&A. So Mark.
So I think I agree with Gus that class collaboration is dangerous and it doesn't lead to good places. But comparing, Spain to the U.S., I'm not sure how well that works. I mean, any sort of a united front, a working class united front in the U.S. will eventually, if it's successful, it should turn into a popular front against fascism. And conversely, a popular front should be led by the working class.
Okay.
That's my response.
Yeah.
Very interesting discussions. The best example of the popular front defeating fascism is called World War II. You had England and France, what was left of France in the U.S. And China at that time under a capitalist, military government, fighting along with the Soviet Union to defeat the Axis powers. Well, it worked, and it wouldn't have worked without it. And the reason the Popular Front failed in Spain was because they couldn't get the capitalists. They couldn't get more capitalists. There was only one socialist state and an arms sent by Mexico to help. So the Popular Front is the way to go. It stopped the fascist takeover in France before World War II, and it would have stopped. It was very valiant what they did. You are correct, Gus, about the strategy of the Communist Party in the 30s against Hitler. They viewed the Socialist Party as social fascist. Now, these people had already killed the heads of the Communist Party, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht. They controlled the state governments and the police forces. They outlawed the Red Front, and they killed communists and murdered them at May Day. So it was difficult for the communists to overcome sectarianism that came from objective conditions to try to unite. But in the end, they did. They asked for a united front with the socialists to stop Hitler, and the socialists said no. So there's reasons things happen. There's definitely mistakes. But the Popular Front is the only thing that stopped Nazism. The Soviet Union played the major role, but it could not have won without support, arms, and everything else, and money that came with a second front, etc. It played the major role, but it was only part of that struggle, also against Japanese imperialism. So, the United Front is very misunderstood. The United Front does not mean that communists give up the class question in the struggle against capitalism. It just says they're doing what the capitalists do to us. We take advantage of the differences among ourselves. The capitalists split us up according to sex and race, etc. We split them up over their own internal differences. And you see it happening now in the struggle against Trump. And the socialist people, the majority of the people that voted in the last election, that supported Bernie Sanders, you're talking 13 million people. But you need 60 to 70 million people to overthrow capitalism and to defeat it. And so what do? We fight against the right first, the far right, which sponsors fascism openly. And we unite with anybody that wants to fight to keep democracy, because it's a life and death struggle for working people. We do not give up our ultimate aim to even fight against the people we're aligned with. But it does mean some compromises, and it's based on the balance of forces. How large is the socialist movement and communist movement today, the anti-capitalist movement? It's not strong enough to put us in a pre-revolutionary situation. So we make compromises to move forward, to split our enemies, and to build a broader unity. The problem is, in doing that, there's no doubt that the pressure of capitalism and bourgeois society makes communists go, to give up their principles sometimes and to make deals that they shouldn't. That's the problem. But you have that no matter what you do. You have it in every political party. You have right-wing groups that support social democracy and collaboration. So I still say the Popular Front is the only way to go to overthrow capitalism and to fight fascism.
Gloria?
I think if we're going to talk about fighting fascism today in the United States, we need we need what happened in Boston recently, when the fascists were just, and that was organized mainly by black women. And I think anything we do to fight fascism has to be organized with or led by workers of color, women, LGBTQ people, the disabled, all the Muslims, all the people that are so affected by the right wing and of course would be by fascism. I think that's the key to what we need to do. I don't think we need to, beg the Democrats or beg the Republicans to do anything. If individuals in those parties want to fight fascism, cool. But those two parties are meant to keep the capitalist system going. So I wouldn't rely on them for 5 minutes to be part of any serious struggle against fascism. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. And I realize I kind of got really out of format because I kind of respond. So now I get like a second time to respond. I'm sorry. Should I not cheat?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I'll double dip. All right. Mark, I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned the United Front into the Popular Front strategy. But I guess that's I kind of view them as kind of not irreconcilably different things, but just very different things that have very different purposes. Like I think the United Front strategy and which wasn't just about stopping fascism, but in general, I don't like front strategies at all. Period. I think that the solution to all these things is revolutionary movements out that come out of class. And that what front strategies do inherently is they kind of rob the class of its autonomy and agency in history, and I kind of want to put it there at its primacy. And I just generally think that the limits of anti-fascism, which once again I'm not trying to be categorically against it, but the limits is that we cannot extrapolate an entire political program out of it. Only class struggle does that. Only struggles against white supremacy I think can do that. But I just don't think that fascism has the capacity to do that. However, I think that fascism does such a thing to civil society that it can I guess possibly set the terrain for the whole capitalist system to be brought into question, and that it's a destabilizing thing. And so I think that we should absolutely have an orientation to anti-fascism, but just kind of remember. Like you said, I think we do agree, about remembering what the goal is and who we're fighting here. But I think that we can make some comparisons from Spain to the USA. I don't think that they're going to be clean or even, but I think that there are some historical lessons there, and that they're really important. It's like, some of the most important lessons, because I think that, we can talk about how the Popular Front worked in that World War II being evidence of the Popular Front. I would disagree that it's evidence of the Popular Front. I would say, and also I would say that we could see a lot of failure of the Popular Front in that still, if we do consider it to be, because we have to remember 11 million people died just as a result of the Holocaust, regardless of of the war and everything. So it's really hard to see victory in World War II at all. But also, how many years was the Popular Front strategy employed before World War II? And we saw a lot of failures. We saw Breslauer, at the first time in the revolutionary area, Trotsky do what he said was trade space for time, only to see the German Empire fall a month later. So there's that, and then 20 years later, at the same spot, you see the Communist Party of the Soviet Union exchange prisoners with the Gestapo. That happened too at the same place 20 years later. And so that to me is what I understand the Popular Front strategy to be, not necessarily World War II. I think World War II wasn't a strategy. I don't think it was just people fighting for their lives. But I think generally also that was a situation of imperialist war that people World War I I'm talking about. Still with Breslauer, the class didn't really have a stake in that war, and so that's where kind of Lenin brings in the revolutionary defeatist strategy. That the only thing that the class can get out of these things is a civil war between classes, period. I just generally kind of want to put it forward there that the best remedy and the best thing that we can do to fight fascism is the things that we should already be doing. Building working class movements, building organizations in our workplaces, our schools, and our neighborhoods, and I guess it's all fascism is built on our failed interventions. So we can't always fight it head on. We need to make the interventions that we were already supposed to be making. So I don't want to say like I said, don't want to let fascists just roll over us. But let's I guess try to have better politics around it. Done.
That's fair. Okay, so now we're to the question, the Q&A portion of our panel. Yes.
I have a question for Gus, actually. So I'm interested in the claim that communism is the most effective way to fight fascism. I'm interested in why you think communism versus, say, anarchism. Why is communism the best or most effective way?
Because I'm a communist and not an anarchist.
Okay. No. But there's a serious concern about dividing the left. This is spreading around about dividing the left.
No, I understand. It depends on what anarchism means to you. Because I used to be an anarchist. I'm not trying to put out there a critique of anarchism, but I would actually have to ask you what you mean by that if you're not willing to say anarchist communist or something like that. Because when I say communist, the other communists in the room generally have the idea, at least the long-term analysis of what we're talking about. We might be have some nuanced differences because of different historical positions that we have and whatnot, but I don't. We're generally understanding the dissolution of these preconditions of fascism, which is, the nation state and class and whatnot, and the role of class society in making fascist movements, and the role of the dissolution of class society in fighting them. So, I guess that's why I have that understanding, because I understand communism to be a classless society, and I understand that class is an important part of fascist movements.
Okay, so we'll start.
To that point, we also have to understand that everyone is going through their own evolutionary processes as far as what part of the spectrum they can espouse, revolutionarily. And so it's a phasic thing. They'll have a point in their life where, of course, syndicalism sounds great, or no, it has to be communism, or no, I'm still a Democrat, or whatever the case may be. So the left in general must embrace a variety of tactics, because otherwise we can't ask people to participate in revolutionary politics beyond their own comfort, beyond their own understanding. So they're going to have to work through that phasic aspect, you know, of the eventuality of, you know, identifying as a communist, or we also have to take into consideration the system that we're responding to. And so it's kind of complicated whenever you talk about modern fascism in America, because the overt fascists are essentially just doing a brutish version of what the state has been doing in a protracted and kind of sneaky smoke and mirrors way to the general public, to marginalized communities, to black and brown people, to immigrants for decades very successfully. It's ostensibly genocide, you know, forced deportations and all these other kinds of things. So to all of the panelists, none in particular, what do you feel about the importance of encouraging a variety of tactics?
Somebody want to go first? Or
Yeah, I think that's important because people who oppose fascism are on all sorts of levels. And it depends what people are able or comfortable doing. I think mass organizing is really the best way, but I think we have to take people where they're at. And also, like in Boston, when 40,000 people came out and stopped the fascists, there were people up front, there were people who knew that they didn't want to get into a physical confrontation, but they wanted to be there and take a stand. So there's levels, and I think that's important to recognize and deal with, because that's the way it is.
Well, it's a good question. Tactics, you first have to have a strategic outlook of what you want to accomplish and how you're going to do it. And the tactics are how you apply that strategy day to day. And like everyone's been saying, people are different levels of development. The strategy is really the content. That's a principal question. It's how you see the world, and it's what you're going to do to achieve your aim. That's a principle. You don't change on that. But the tactical question, a lot of people on the far left or the anarchist movement make a principle out of the tactical question. In other words, the use of violence or sit-ins, or are we going to vote, or whatever it may be. But that's not, and never should be, a principal question. The principal question is your aims, how you're going to get there. The tactical is the application, and that can be varied. And it can be different for different cities, different groups. And so it needs to be, you have to be very open-minded about the tactical question.
Yeah. Also, what we've seen is that fascists just get confused when there's a variety of tactics, because they're prepared for only one thing, and that's just the street scuffle. But when they're encountering, sometimes they're encountering Black Bloc tactics, and specific when it's used for specific purposes, and sometimes they're encountering nonviolent
Clowns.
Yeah, or clowns. Yeah, and that makes it more effective because they're less able to, think on their feet and adapt. And of course, yeah, the working class is at different, stages of development that, they're not all as radicalized. So obviously, if we want to draw a wider cross-section of the working class, more tactics have to be available.
unless you want to respond.
No.
Okay.
I guess I have two things, one of which is just a brief comment and then a question. I agree pretty strongly with Gus on the irreconcilability of these ideas of the United Front and the Popular Front, specifically around the autonomy that they provide to radical working class movements when you engage in that front strategy. I think one of the primary failures of the Popular Front historically has been the loss of autonomy of radical working class movements to these more socially liberal movements historically. And I was I agree wholeheartedly with all the panelists when they say that the best strategy we have of fighting the far right is to engage in mass movement building. And I think in order to do that, the left has to provide a clear pole of attraction to the working class in a radical sense, and that can only be done through maintaining the autonomy of our movement. So I see that as kind of being a key differentiator between the United Front tactic and the Popular Front tactic. And maybe Bernard, I guess, might want to respond to that. And certainly I would welcome that. But my question is for Gloria. You mentioned a difference in the rise of some of these far-right fascist movements that we're seeing now, being that the police are able to serve more as an outlet for these fascist tendencies. And I would of course agree with you on the relationship between the police and fascism and on the way that they work together. But I wonder maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean in terms of that being different from previous fascist movements, whether in some way the current structure of the police and their role within our current capitalist system is different from what we've seen with previous fascist periods. What's your thoughts around that?
Previous, what are you referring to?
Well, what I understood from your what you said, and maybe I'm misunderstanding you, that the police currently, it was somewhat unique that they're serving as an outlet for those fascist tendencies, and I mean, I guess I would argue that that's been true in Spain and Germany. And then in most places where we've seen the rise of fascism. So I'm wondering if you think there's something different about that now than previously.
I don't think so. I think the role of the police have always been to keep the state in power.
Right.
So, and 50 years ago in Houston, for example, the police were practically all white. Now you've got Black, Latino, Arab.
It's majority non-white now.
Huh?
I think they said it's majority non-white now.
Is it really?
It's like 55%
And
non-white.
a lot of women. I remember one time when I got arrested for something, I was in the jail, and this female cop was beating the shit out of this black woman, and I thought, oh boy, that's real women's liberation to get beat up by another woman. But I don't think that there's significant difference. Not really.
There was also a comment for Bernard on the, I guess, United Front.
What was the question on the Popular?
I guess it was more of a comment just on the difference between the Popular Front and the United Front in terms of the position of radical working class movements to more liberal movements and the autonomy that those two front tactics afford radical working class movements.
Well, United Front is basically it's a front with groups that are from the left. Doesn't include the capitalists. And Popular Front is groups with the left, and it includes sections of the capitalist class who at this particular time will unite with you on a certain issue. So it's just like going to someone in the Democratic Party and saying, look, I really don't like you and I want to get rid of you, but I don't have the strength to do it right now, and Trump here has taken away my job, he's going to kill us all, etc., and you don't like him either. Can we unite for a temporary period and fight together against him? It's like a boxing match. Two people are hitting each other. Your right arm is always the strongest. So you punch that right arm as much as you can until it's useless, and the guy only has his left arm, and he's not left-handed. That's how you defeat capitalism. You divide and you conquer. If you're sectarian about it and you refuse to unite with other people on certain issues, and it's only a temporary basis, because there's no Democrat that's going to support, they don't even support Bernie Sanders. Look at, Hillary's latest book. We know who these people are, but we also know they have interests that are quite different based on monetary reasons, not ideological, but monetary reasons, why they oppose the fascists or Trump or what the Republicans are doing. So we take advantage of that. They do the same thing with us. So why shouldn't we do the same thing with them? And it does work. It doesn't mean it works every time, but the United Front does not work and never has.
Can I respond
Oh, yeah.
to that? So, I mean, in the U.S. we don't have, social democrats. We're not talking about a popular front with, social democracy. We're talking about the Democratic Party, which are outright capitalists. And we've seen from these struggles that they have no plan to fight fascism, and they're very happy to be passive. So, I'm not sure of what value a united or a popular front with the Democrats would be, and what sort of compromises we would be making. Now, we've also seen class collaboration turn really bad. Like, a really bad way of fighting fascism was, well, what happened in Russia in the late 90s, early aughts, where you had, it seemed like, half the young people you met would be either skinheads or some sort of, fascist-aligned people. Every time you go to a party, someone gets beaten up for being, too Ukrainian or too Georgian or something like that. And fascists were marching constantly. So what their response was a movement called Nash, which means ours, which just the name is obvious what they are. They're super nationalists. Putin Youth is what they are. It's a pro-Putin youth organization. They call themselves Youth Democratic Anti-Fascist Movement. Anti-fascist is in their name, but they're super nationalist, pro-Putin. They're funded by Putin-friendly businesses, capitalists, and by Kremlin themselves, obviously. And they're what they claim is they're anti-fatherland union. They're fighting an anti-fatherland union of oligarchs, anti-Semites, Nazis, and liberals. But really, they're supported by the capitalists and the state, and that's absolutely the wrong thing. This is what happens when the perception is that the only defense against fascism is the establishment. When people think that the only defense against fascism is a union with capitalists and Democrats. And we don't want that. We don't want our only defense against fascism to be Trump youth or even Bernie Sanders youth.
It doesn't. I would say we don't want it to be a defense at all because this world's not defensible. We're not trying to defend liberal democracy. Like that's not for me. It's not on my game plan. Like it's not.
Well, the Popular Front is not with the Democratic Party. It's with those that have illusions within the Democratic Party, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, etc., without which you will not have a revolutionary change. If you're not based in the working class and the civil rights movement, there is nothing. Nothing will ever happen. It will be all white, and you're already dividing everyone. It has to be based in labor. And labor, the labor leaders, you look at the AFL-CIO, it's got 84 affiliates here in Houston. The most reactionary ones, like the Carpenters Union, they hold back the more advanced ones. So the more advanced ones that want to break with Democrats can't, because they'll lose these. Because they lose these unions. I know it's ridiculous and it's horrible, but those are the reality because it's based on the consciousness that people have that develop differently. And if you don't understand that, you can't build alliances. The left cannot do it on its own. Again, 13 million votes for Bernie, and many of those people are just, liberal Democrats or maybe what you might call a revolutionary Democrat, is not going to do it. You've got to go beyond it. That means you have to make a compromise. When the left gets stronger, you make less compromises. But you have to get there first, or you just beat your head against the wall.
I'm not laughing at you. I was in the Carpenters Union for 10 years.
Well, you know what I mean, right?
Oh.
Yeah. They're opposed to immigration. They're horrible. They're horrible.
I got a question down there.
Yeah. So what I've heard all of you definitely agree on communally is that we need a mass movement, right? You mentioned how Bernie Sanders' incredibly successful campaign, which I'm sure is a large reason that many of us even took the time to come to in this room today, was built on like these bread and butter demands. Those are the things he put forward that united us across like a huge range of ideology, from people on the far left to like your conservative, church-going, racist right that we think we're irreconcilable with, these small town people, right? So how, I want to hear from the panel, like how do you think, what can we like do? Do you think there is like a common struggle that we can work towards to start building a mass movement through whatever tactics different groups might have? Do you see that struggle on the horizon, and how do you see us working towards that?
I'll go first. Well, there's three areas in Marxism that are areas of struggle. And those are the three areas we have to work in. The one is the ideological struggle. That's our newspapers, our books and our internet, and talking to people, Marxist classes, etc. Talking to people, convincing them. And then the second is the economic struggle, and that's the struggle of the working class against capitalism. They get a more fair share of their exploitation. And then the third, and the most important, which is usually overlooked by the ultra-left and by the anarchists, is the political struggle. And the political struggle is the electoral struggle. That's what it is. You have tens of thousands of people that have died and been in prison to fight for the right to vote. Now, it's a different form of democracy. It's called bourgeois democracy, and it's not a real democracy because they take it away every time. I mean, you fight for women's rights, you get a bill passed, and then the right wing gets elected and they take it away 2 years later. But that's how you educate people that capitalism is not democratic and that only socialism will bring about democracy permanently. And so these are the type of things that it's the political struggle is the most important thing, because when you elect someone, you give them a little bit of state power. Now, how they deal with that state power is something different. In the turn of the century, the left criticized the Socialist Party that had mayors, etc. They called it sewer socialist. I don't know if y'all have ever heard that term, but that's the term that was used. But those socialists put sewers in working class neighborhoods to help get rid of disease and everything else. They even controlled police departments where they wouldn't break up strikes and stuff. So, you don't make a leap from where we are now to socialism. It just doesn't happen. And consciousness doesn't work that way. It works in a dialectical process that's based on your relationship to the means of production and your personal interactions with the capitalist system. And you can tell people all day that we need socialism, and it's not going to mean anything until they experience being hit on the head by a police officer or shot or something like that. That's how people learn in the end.
No, that's not the only way people learn. Yeah, like you said, a bread and butter issue. So the way you mobilize the largest cross-section of the working class are, the more immediate issues. So, things like 5 for 15 and Medicare, those things, are relevant to the working class, and they will mobilize the working class, and they'll be, part of the bigger struggle against capitalism. And also, the role of the party is important. When you're in a pre-revolutionary situation, like in Italy, when the party leadership isn't there and the revolution fails, that's what creates, reactionary backlash, and that's what, lets fascists, creates the room for fascists to really seize power. So, yeah.
I have a question for you. Why did you say that people were here tonight because of Bernie Sanders' campaign?
Well, I think speaking from being someone my age in the millennial group, right?
Yeah.
I think I became politically engaged for the first time because of Bernie Sanders' campaign. It's basically what gave me hope that change, like something good can come from the political system, and that gave me the desire to actually start to learn about a system which had never been taught to me growing up in public school or through my religious family or anything like that. And that's like a similar story I've heard from a lot of people in my age group. Of course, some people have been really educated before, but like he popularized, for one thing, just the word socialism has become a lot more socially acceptable because of his campaign. And it's like you look at the DSA membership and like Socialist Alternative membership that I'm a part of, and they've both just shot up over the last year, and that has a lot to do with the impact of his campaign, but also just he was able to generate like a massive volunteer base of a lot of people who were not a part of politics at all before.
How old are you?
I'm 23.
When I was, I guess about your age, can't remember exactly, but I didn't consider myself a revolutionary at all. But in fact, I remember supporting one of the Kennedys. Now I think that was pretty stupid. But when my father, who was a right-wing John Bircher and in the oil business, heard me say I supported the Kennedys, he says, "No daughter of mine's going to be a communist."
My parents still say that.
Huh?
My parents still say that.
So I can relate to what you're saying, because we all, at that time, I don't think and of course the Kennedys weren't even talking about socialism. At least Bernie, like you said, popularized that word. So I think, like we've said before, we all develop, we learn, and different things in our life take us to different levels of political awareness.
I do want to add one thought to that, though. I think that, obviously my personal story is important, to me and stuff, but it's representative of a much broader thing that was proven by his campaign. Because, I read a comic book about Marxism when I was in 9th grade and just, cried on the bus on the way home. Because, and I was made fun of as, socialist Hannah in my youth group, even though I had no idea what that actually meant. I've always had these ideals, but it's never been legitimized before, and he showed the way to do that, which is through bringing people together by having, concrete bread and butter issues. And so I think that's what I'm really passionate about, is, finding a way to focus on. Is, how do we, let's keep having these meetings, but, let's find the way forward, let's find the issue we're going to focus on.
Can we go to Gus to respond, and we have some more questions as well.
Yeah, I just want to raise something real quick, or just kind of ask you a question. Was it really Bernie himself that really moved you, or was it and moved all these other youth, or was it the conditions of the class in this historical moment? Because it's not just it's not just your group, it's not just Bernie, it's lots of groups. I'm in a group that didn't exist a year and a half ago, and we cannot keep up with the interest and the membership and the growth and everything. And so. It's a lot of things, and the fascists are growing in ways that they haven't before either. So I think it's just kind of a powder keg. The class is more immiserated than it has been in decades, and that's a major part of it. There's also more proletarians living on this planet than at any other point, in history. So we have that to be optimistic about. It seems like we're living in very dark times. We are, but let's be optimistic, because this is a time for a revolutionary movement. And I identify as a revolutionary. Gloria, we all identify as revolutionaries. So let's try to be that. Yeah.
You had a question, yeah.
Just a couple of things to say, a couple of points based on the discussion. I've pretty much come to a dead end trying to understand the world through political science and through ideology. And so I use other disciplines, history, biology, mammal behavior, anthropology, sociology, psychology, and so, but mainly history. And another point here, the definition of fascism. Rats eat cheese, but eating cheese doesn't define the rat. The behavior of fascists does not define fascism. We need more of a theoretical definition that's based on class analysis, and so then we need to get into history. The word fascism itself, it's basically a bundle of sticks wrapped up with a cord, which was used by the emperor of Rome as a symbol of his authority. He would give one of these sticks to his general, and so when they went off to Gaul or to wherever, he had the power of the emperor. Okay, and so this bundle of sticks, that is the fasci. That's where the word fascism comes from. And you can see it today in the U.S. Congress. You know, on either side of the center podium, there it is, the fasci. Okay, and so that happened around 1910 when they installed the fasci in Congress, and it was about 10 years later that Mussolini formed his fascist party. So you could say that Mussolini was influenced by the U.S. and also Hitler. I mean, Hitler was modeling his program on what had happened in the U.S., the depopulation of the entire continent of the indigenous people. That was Hitler's, in the U.S., that was Hitler's plan for Africa. He wanted to see Africa, a bunch of white farmers, right? And so Hitler was a huge fan of the U.S. And so we need to go back to the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, to get a good definition of fascism based on class analysis. And what it boils down to, in the Enlightenment, you saw the business class. A lot of people think of capitalists, you know, but that was the educated class at the time, and they thought they should be ruling things, as opposed to this hereditary monarchy that's connected to this, you know, huge church structure. And so that's pretty much, you know, the revolution, and it creates one type of fascism, constitutional fascism, fascism with rule of law, which is very important to the capitalist class. You have to be able to enforce contracts to make capitalism work, okay? And so that's the big mistake Hitler made and Mussolini when they created the second type of fascism, which is dictatorial fascism. They didn't have the rule of law. And you see the capitalist class, you know, glomming on to this kind of fascism at first, and then they abandon ship like rats because they can't enforce contracts, and they take their money up someplace else. And a little more historical roots of fascism is that it goes back to an art movement. Michael will appreciate this. It's the futurist movement, and they're basically anarchists before they're fascists. You know, Mussolini was an anarchist in Italy in the late 1800s, and he just sort of evolved or devolved into this right-wing fascist thing. But the theoretical founders of fascism were not Mussolini. It was Baccioni and a few other artists of this movement in Italy. It's a very amazing avant-garde art movement called Futurism, which was more anarchistic than it was fascist. It was very progressive. It was very feminist. It was, you know, against the Catholic Church dominating things. And so when, you know...
Sorry, do you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I'm a historian. I'm trying to
Okay,
enlighten
no,
you.
it's... Would you like to ask a question also? Like the kind of taking in...
I can take questions, but that's basically it. You know, you've got two kinds of fascism, and it's really tied in with imperialism and capitalism to the point that you can't separate it, and it's pointless to try to differentiate between imperialism and fascism. I mean, from the very beginning of the Roman Empire, that's it.
Anybody want to respond to that? Okay.
I had a question for Mark, and my question is, I like everything you said about like diversity of tactics and better like issues, but my question is, depending on if I understood correctly, you hinted at a criticism of a leftist gun culture. Is that correct that I picked up on that?
No, well, I'm definitely a fan of gun culture.
Okay.
Or let's say not culture, but guns. But there's, I guess, a bigger question of, you know, tactics and is it wise to bring guns to a protest?
Okay.
And, you know, what happens to movement building once guns get involved?
All right.
And, you know, what we've seen is, you know, once there's an arms race, movement building just stops.
So my question for you then is, what is your take on like the Deacons of Defense and the Black Panthers, which were all largely based on guns and bringing guns to protest and providing security for nonviolent groups?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, security for nonviolent groups makes sense. And I mean, the Black Panthers were in a very different situation. They had a legitimate self-defense argument, which we don't really have that argument, especially, you know, not in the sort of confrontations we've had in Houston. Now, people in Boston and in Charlottesville There's been, different reports, some anti-fascists had guns, and people said, in some cases maybe it was a deterrent, but I guess maybe someone who's actually been there would have a better perspective. But right now, I think it's an open question whether guns really have.
Can you elaborate on how we don't have a legitimate self-defense stance? Is it just be like Houstonians? Because I'm not from Houston, so I don't get the current local climate. But
just our protests haven't been particularly violent, and police tactics haven't been particularly violent, and we're still building a movement. We're trying to get more working class people to come to these events, and openly displaying guns and provoking fascists is going to turn away a large section of the working class. But it might just be more satisfying to punch a fascist than to wave a gun around. But I'm sure. Thank you.
The Deacons for Defense, you're talking about Rob Williams and May Mallory?
Yeah.
I know that my party supported them wholeheartedly. I guess in the 60s? I'm trying to remember when that happened. But I think when you talk about armed self-defense, people like Rob Williams and May Mallory definitely have the right to do that, and so did the Black Panther Party. And while, like you say, our demonstrations don't wind up into shootouts with the cops on the streets, but the cops occupy working class and particularly oppressed communities, and there is violence. And, I think if somebody in whatever neighborhood wanted to take up arms and do that, I think they should be supported. But that was one of the reasons that the head of the Black Panther Party got killed here, is they were selling their newspaper on Dowling Street, and a cop came out and he pulled a gun on Carl Hampton, and Carl pulled his gun on him, and it became a standoff. So then they issued an arrest warrant for him, and many of us from the John Brown Revolutionary League, the Mexican American Youth Organization, and other groups who were working with the Black Panthers, we did overnight armed defense of their headquarters to try to prevent the cops from killing him. And the night that they did kill him, there had been a Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War over on the east side of town that a lot of us went to, and we were sunburned and hot and tired. We didn't go down to Dowling Street that night with our weapons. We were stationed in empty buildings to where we could see the Panther headquarters. And that was the night when they had the smallest number of people there that the cops came in and killed him from the roof of a church.
Yeah, let me just say something about this. We have a demonstration. The fascists are across from us. Let them be the ones that are armed. When I see people on the left at a demonstration here in Houston with semi-automatic weapons, I'm thinking, first off, police provocateur, because that's exactly what the police want. And once it starts, who's going to win? Those guys are ex-police and ex-military. They're going to win. And if they don't, the police are going to come in and make sure they do. So you don't do an armed struggle until you're ready to win. And that will come. And there will be an armed struggle one day. And when it does, we will win. But you don't use force until you're ready to win. Otherwise, nobody's going to come to your demonstration and oppose fascists. You're not going to have 40,000. If the fascists were to open up and shoot 5 people in Boston, the next time there's a demonstration, watch what happens. We need billions of people out there. And again, I'll go to Martin Luther King. People say, well, he's a pacifist. He wasn't a pacifist. He understood totally that he was putting people in the line of violence and he was using force. But it was a different form of force. And it worked. And it gave our side, and it worked. It brought the Civil Rights Act, which some people would say finished the bourgeois revolution here, as far as that was concerned. Of course, it's all been turned back now, but it still reached up to that level. And those are the tactics that work. Millions armed struggle when the time comes, not yet.
Yeah, okay, so I would have first make one thing really clear. I don't think it's very principled to call them police provocateurs. You know, I want to support those people politically, and I'm not going to stop pursuing having more guns and protests here. So, I mean, that's fine, but, you know, but those people aren't police provocateurs, and just because they're not in this room doesn't mean that it's okay to say that. I have political differences with those people as well. Don't think it's okay. Another thing, the people on the right, them having guns and them you know, the fascists being attracted to guns and being ex-military and ex-cop and stuff. Why aren't we recruiting those people? Like, I'm okay. The ex-cop thing, yeah, I'm a little bit sketched out by that. But like ex-military and stuff, those are people that we need to consolidate within our movements and stuff. I mean, veterans have been a central part of every anti-war movement ever. So recruiting them, those people are becoming fascists because they're the ones with the guns. So it's not about being ready to win. The conditions to win are here now. You know, and they've been there as long as there's been a communist movement. And so it's centered on existing conditions. So I don't want to ever say that we're not ready to win. If we're not ever ready to win, then we're always going to be ready to lose. Like I don't understand that, I guess. The ready. I mean, it seems kind of arbitrary and subjective, and then it raises questions of methodology and stuff. But I also want to delineate as well with, you know, the original question as well. There's a difference to me between community self-defense and anti-fascism. I'm not necessarily sure we need guns at every anti-fascist thing. You know, I think that we should be at gun shows and stuff, and that's why I'm in an organization that's out there and stuff. But you know, but community self-defense, though, I mean, that's a strategy that's worked. You know, people mentioned Rob Williams, and you know, there's a precedence in American history of, you know, particularly, you know, and I think that this is, you know, kind of where revolutionary movements here center on is, you know, the black working class in particular. When they, you know, when they move, everybody moves. But community self-defense has been really important, I think, to revolutionary history in America. So I want to delineate between all those and having, I guess, different political positions on those.
So can I just follow up?
Yeah.
So yeah, just to be clear, I'm definitely in favor of arming workers, you know, training with weapons, and, you know, defending communities with weapons if, you know, necessary. And definitely agree with making a class appeal to the military. Got a question for Bernard. Like, is there any value in, you know, in left-wing groups being seen with guns, sending a message, you know, that we're not liberals, you know, we're militant, and, you know, the sections of the working class who are just turned off by, you know, soft, you know, the stereotype of this soft liberal, you know, sending a message that we're not liberals, we're, you know, we're the, you know, harder, more militant. Like, is there any value in that?
Yeah, there can be. I'm not against the left having guns. I'm not against the left having armed groups. I'm not against the left defending themselves with force and with arms when they're under attack. But to use it and to build up toward a fight that you can't win is suicidal. And I understand where you're coming from, and I sympathize with the idea that you have to believe you can win. But idealism isn't what's going to win. It's practical stuff based on, you know, on real life. And just because I say I want socialism doesn't mean I'm going to get it. Between here and there, it's a long, difficult process where sometimes you go backwards one step to move forward twice. You always are going to make mistakes, have retreats, and move forward. That's the way it is. And until we have a revolution, you know, we're going to have that problem after a revolution too. It's not going to end. The class struggle, in fact, will intensify after the revolution.
So can I see the hands for questions? Because I saw hands going up and down. So okay, so let's take 2 short questions. Good. Fleet, Michael, and then we'll take a question. And actually, I'll add myself in. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a very fundamental question. So my mind always goes blank when I talk in front of people, so I wrote it out. Okay, so fascism as a label is an accusation leveled at almost everyone. Everyone calls anyone they don't like a fascist. Many of us feel like we have a general understanding of the term, but I think that our definitions very dramatically differ from each other. Some people say racists or nationalists or misogynists are inherently fascists. But we all have our own definitions of who is racist or nationalist or sexist. And those definitions can vary dramatically. So, bearing that in mind, my question is, what is fascism? How does it emerge? Who are the real fascists today in the US and globally? And depending on our answers to these questions, how many fascists are there in the US and globally? How much of a force is fascism really?
And also, Michael, you're going to ask a question.
It sounds like a whole term paper.
Great oration.
It's a bit of a different note. I was just going to ask, like, how fascism is right now in America, like how its proponents are. They really, one way that they not necessarily organize themselves into like actual like building real organizations, but one way that they really recruit people into their ideology is through like social media and like meme culture, like 4chan, like PayPay and all that. Like, I'm just curious to hear each of your thoughts on like challenging that in that specific way and going after young people, and because I think it's like a very significant underground thing that isn't really talked about in any kind of public way, and it's not really being addressed, I would say, in any meaningful way. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about that, like how they recruit through social media, like memes and things like that.
So just to summarize, because these are two very different questions, we had Fleet asked, what is fascism? How does it emerge? How many fascists are there in the U.S.? It's a bit quantitative question. And then also going after how the fascists, and I guess also alt-right, recruit people via social media meme culture, it's like 4chan and things like that.
Yeah, saying I can go?
But yeah, who wants to jump in? Yeah.
Okay, I would highly, if you're trying to learn more about today's alt-right and the fascist movement today, don't read that book by Angela Negro Kill All Normies. Like, I really don't recommend. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read enough excerpts just to be kind of cringed out at it a little bit. But I would recommend by Matthew Lyons of the blog Three-Way Fight. He wrote Control Alt Delete. I would definitely recommend that one because he did a lot of really good research, and I heard him give it in talk form, and it was very, very good. So, and I can't say how many there are today. Have really, that's a very good question. But I want to talk, you kind of asked some, I think, categorical questions. Everybody tonight has been kind of like asking for a definition and stuff. And so I kind of wanted to, bring out a few things that, I've discovered about fascism. So they're more characteristics. But we're talking about something that's politically depends on the elevation of a nation state and its fusion with capital. That can mean a lot of things, but I've seen that kind of regurgitate a lot. But it consistently creates disorder while preaching order. And so that's important to understand and see, because we can see that consistently. It's a movement of the disaffected middle class with working class characteristics and orientation. It's important to remember that Mussolini's paper it said at the bottom, it said to the laborer and to the veteran, because those are the people that he actually wanted to elevate. It's born in the streets. So it has kind of like the same. I don't want to call fascism revolutionary, because to us it's counter-revolutionary, but it has revolutionary flavor. So it's born in the streets, and it is pretty much dependent on, and this is why I think it's kind of important to maybe not call all the history of American white supremacy fascism, but it's the appropriation of left-wing tactics and left-wing forms of organization for right-wing goals and aims. Tori mentioned the fasci and the workers' organizations and the class organizations that were actually organs of legit organs of class struggle, became the kernels of fascism. And so, they don't really have tactics and anything that we don't already give to them. They take everything from us. So It's in Charlottesville. We saw them in the streets chanting, "Whose streets? Our streets." They got that from us. Where else did they get that? So they are aware of what they're doing. They love it. They're like, oh yeah, the commies do cool stuff too. Yeah. So I mean, there's almost always a that's kind of inherent in third positionism. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there for anybody kind of looking for a more anatomical understanding of fascism, because that's kind of in a nutshell for me.
If I could follow up on that.
Yeah.
So Michael's question, the people who are getting radicalized online, it's all happening anonymously. But once they actually hit the streets and they get exposed publicly as fascists, a lot of them find out that their social lives are ruined, their careers are ruined. So it takes a lot to actually transition from anonymous shitposting to, going on the streets. And a lot of them try it once and go back, especially when they're confronted with real opposition and with real force. So a lot of them end up trying it once. The ones who stay become harder to form more dangerous cadres and so on. But it just judging it by the number of far right memes, that's not a valuable metric. For definition of fascism, one I've heard of by an Italian anarchist who called it a preemptive counter-revolution, which sounds convincing. And I still think the definition that I started out with, which is nice and concise, is pretty valuable. Pursuit of transcendent and cleansing nation-statism through paramilitarism. So paramilitary element of that is very important because it is a from the ground up movement, and the appeal of the third way is a big part of it, and of course cleansing, claiming to get rid of all the parliamentary horse trading, all of that is part of the appeal of fascism. And also, Mussolini did start out as a Marxist, and he learned the language of Marx. He learned about class struggle, and then he applied it the other way of the petite bourgeoisie against the working class. So there is a bit of a left to right grip.
Well, and I agree with a lot that's being said here. Fascism is basically a fraud, and it does take from the left and uses it for its own purposes. But and fascism takes different forms. Fascism in Italy is quite different from fascism in Germany or fascism in other countries. It differs. But one thing they all have in common is the elimination of the democratic rights of everybody and setting up a totalitarian type of regime where every organization you belong to is controlled by the state and having to associate with something from the Nazi or fascist type party. People really misuse the term fascist quite a bit. If we were under fascism today, we wouldn't be meeting. In fact, we'd all be dead or in prison, concentration camps, that's a fact. That's how bad fascism is, and that's the difference between it and just right-wing imperialism, et cetera. There is a really big difference. But fascism is sort of like the capitalists. Fascism comes in when capitalism is in crisis, and they can no longer rule in the normal way. According to Lenin and Marx and others, the best way for capitalism to rule is through bourgeois democracy. It's the best cover for exploitation, murder, racism, etc., because it fools people. But when it begins to fall apart and people can pull the veil apart and see what capitalism really is, that's when they start bringing in the fascists, because they can no longer rule in the old way. And they say, well, and by the way, the capitalists don't like the fascists. They really don't. There may be a couple that do, but the majority don't, because they prefer to make their profits fooling everybody and having everybody being patriotic and loving the country and thinking they have a say in it. But when they need them, they bring them in like a gangster, and they say, I need you to do a job for me. Now, the gangster says, sure, I'll do it, but I may kill a couple of y'all as well. And that's the danger that they have when they do it. They prefer not to, but they do it when they have to, and that's what fascism is. We're not in a fascist situation yet, but they're coming around because capitalism is in crisis. And so that's the big fight. And fascism in the 20s was a direct result of the Bolshevik Revolution. And don't think it wasn't anything else. The capitalists understood it. And that's the most important thing.
Now, is that really true? Because, by the time Mussolini comes to power, the threat of Bolshevik revolution is just, it's non-existent. I mean, they claimed that they were protecting Italy from, Bolshevism, but that's really a false claim because, the crisis was over, Italy was in recovery, and the revolution was successfully crushed by social democracy. So capitalists didn't really need to bring in these dangerous fascists, but they did anyway. So, maybe material conditions aren't sufficient to explain fascism.
But, you said we're not living under fascism. No, we're not. But I think it's important to stop them in their tracks wherever they are. Absolutely. Because particularly since Trump was elected, he has emboldened these people. So we don't want to give them an edge at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, so what you said, about fascism, we're not in a fascist situation, but, they're gaining traction and everything. I'd say the same thing about revolution, we're not in a revolutionary situation, but we're gaining traction and growing, and a lot of us can see our organizations growing. But I forgot almost what else I was going to respond to. Something that Mark said. I forgot. I just kind of wanted to go back to the CPI. I guess we're just going to disagree about the role of the Communist Party of Italy during that period and really everything that they had to lose and whatnot. I mean, they were going through a factional struggle and everything, but they were also, at greater mass power than they would be for decades until, and those decades later, they didn't really even matter so much anymore, in my opinion. No, I definitely think that the CPI was revolutionary at the time. I think that the class was revolutionary at the time. In Italy, and they were setting up councils and whatnot, and the CPI was having debates about their role in the council movement and whatnot, and they were healthy debates, and they were debates that helped grow the party and everything, and the question of fascism as well. Some of the people who fought the hardest against fascism in Italy were the people who were most critical of anti-fascism and brought and are kind of responsible for at least my soft critique, or I try to have a healthy critique of anti-fascism, but I draw a lot of mine from the Italian anti-fascists and the Communist Party during that period, so I would definitely kind of look into that. But yeah.
I was going to abuse my moderator privilege to ask a question. I think everyone has been looking for this definition of fascism, and by the way, I'm not going to give the perfect one right now, but just to put
please.
I know, I'll solve everything right here. Historically, I guess when fascism was first emerging, it was understood as the failure of the socialist movement. So one of the reasons all of these different organizations and groups, and even uniforms, were ceded over to the fascists, is because those people were communists prior. But these revolutions were not panning out, so we could take someone like Mussolini, who's well, if it's not communism, I guess we're going to need fascism. We're going to need something else to be the power, to be the insurrection. They want a revolution. So I guess today, if we're seeing, this fascism rising, or at least growing to a proportion that is threatening, at least related to the last decade, in what way does this reflect, I guess, then, the best way I can put it is a failure of the left even, right? In other words, if somehow these people are being picked up online via, 4chan, or I don't visit these sites, but what I've heard of them, in what way does this reflect the, I guess, inability for the left to make itself even relevant to people? On the one hand, anti-fascism, yes, Mitt Romney came out after Charlottesville and said, yeah, and, I saw the memes that were Comrade Mitt Romney or something. But, but that also that shows the kind of dearth in a way of, why is it that, yeah, people will get behind that part, of course, we like to punch Nazis, but how do we get them behind communism or socialism? Right, that they can run up to that. And that's not, an arbitrary question of we can just, let me show you some literature or books. But there's a real history there that people go, well, I want the anti-fascism maybe without the communism, because I've seen where that leads or something like that. So I guess my question is, how does that reflect a potential failure of the left in the present? Or maybe you disagree with that. That's fine as well.
You're not going to get any arguments from me.
Well, I mean, I know I'll jump in. I mean, the obvious answer would be, the working class is demoralized. The left hasn't demonstrated, a way forward, a way to struggle to win demands. Once working people see, power, their power as a class, that they can achieve demands, that starts, not just, getting people to sympathize, but to mobilize people, right? And, once you're building a movement, you can get people onto the streets. And if you don't have that, there's other, non-materialist ideologies that people will ridicule.
Well, we live in the most powerful imperialist power in the history of the world. They control everything. It's difficult to build a communist and workers' movement. It's hard just to form trade unions. It's hard to fight for women's rights. It's hard for African Americans to be able to leave their house and to go to work without being killed. It's the country we live in. And it's much easier to work for 8-10 hours a day, go home and have a beer, sit on your couch and watch all the trash that's on TV. It's very easy. So how do you get people off the couch and out into the streets? It's only going to happen when things get bad enough that it affects them and it hurts them more than capitalism helps them. And we haven't reached that stage yet, but we're going there. That's why Bernie got so much support. He was able to take concepts about socialism and make it very simple for everyone to understand. It's not like reading Lenin or Marx or something like that. He was able to take everything and make it very simple. Not that I agree with everything Bernie says, but he was a genius at taking and building a minimal program and getting 13 million people to vote for him. And that's what was fantastic about him. And it changed the consciousness. The Occupy movement brought about one major thing in consciousness, the idea of the 1%. That was a revolutionary change in people's conception of class struggle. And then Bernie took it a step further and brought the idea of socialism, and yes, we can have free medical aid, and yes, we can do this and that. So it's step by step. One thing builds on the other. Just like any type of science, you start here, someone builds on it. You don't make leaps. You don't think whatever I think is going to be real. It's based on actual actions and work in real life, people's experiences.
With material demands.
Yeah.
Real
The word
stuff.
to look for is transitional.
Right.
But then a single spark can start a prayer of fire.
Well, the political party has to be there.
Yeah.
But the Bolshevik Party did not actually make the revolution. They became the leaders of it, and they directed it. But the revolution was made by the peasants and the workers. And when they rise up and there is no political party, or it makes a mistake, had Lenin not come back from Germany, Russia would have had a bourgeois government and there would have been no revolution. Probably no Chinese revolution. The world would have been totally different. It's just incredible that you have to have the organization, but also the role that the individual can play in history. Because every Bolshevik was against overthrowing capitalism, except for Molotov and Kollontai. Every one of them. Lenin had to argue and fight with them to do what needed to be done. And he said that it's like an art. And if it's not done right when it needs to be done, history will pass you up and never forget you.
Gus?
That's an interesting understanding of the history of the Bolsheviks, but I'll give you that. Yeah, I guess I'm not going to respond. I mean, we could go back and forth all day. I mean, I agree with you. I just I think that they didn't want to overthrow capitalism because they just didn't so much have it yet. And the NEP was, as Lenin called it, socialism in retreat, or the best that they could do. But I don't think that was necessarily because they didn't want to overthrow capitalism, or that they didn't understand. I don't know. Never mind.
That's fair. Okay, can I just see who has questions? Just right now. Okay, I could answer. Okay.
So the good news is it's a lot easier to stop the KKK and the Nazis than it is from stopping the fascists. The fascists have imperial navies and they have police forces, and they're the ones that are standing between the anti-fascists and the Nazis and the gun nuts over on the other side. How did we stop them in 1983? So Gloria and Bernard are going to remember this. In Texas, there pretty much hasn't been any Klan marches in Texas, in the big cities, since around 83 for the most part, because we priced them out of the market. We made it too expensive for them. And we didn't know how successful we were until really a few months after these two big protests. But the KKK were on a big recruiting drive. So they had, a couple dozen guys, all these different uniforms, and they were doing their parades. They were going to be in all the big cities. And there was two of these big Klan marches 2 weeks apart, Austin and Houston. In Austin, they just used the regular Austin PD and then the state troopers on the grounds of the Capitol, where their march wound up. And we mobilized enough people. I was with John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and Bernard and Gloria with some other groups. Maybe, Gloria, were you with John Brown at that point?
No, I was in Workers' World, but I was in
Workers'
Austin
World.
for that.
Right. So we were, everybody showed up, and we kicked the Klan's ass. We destroyed their cars. It's a really great story. I'll tell you that for later. But we kicked their ass. We, smashed their cars. And we thought, wow, we're successful. And we're going to do it even better 2 weeks from now in Houston. And so we organized, I think it was like somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people showed up to protest the KKK in downtown Houston. My group, John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, was organizing in Louisiana, amongst church groups to bring buses of black people into Houston for this Klan demo. And the HPD couldn't handle it. They had the FBI working on this for them at that time, and they knew the extent of how big this demo was going to be. They saw how we ruined their party 2 weeks previously in
How big
Austin.
the counter demo was going to be.
Yeah, and so there wasn't enough cops in Houston. They hired 5 other police departments to come and protect the fucking Klan. And, all the king's horses, all the king's men. And at that point, guess what? They won. They protected the Klan. They closed off 10 square blocks of city, around City Hall. And, you couldn't even drive near City Hall. You had to walk like half a mile to get to the demo against the Klan. And they arrested all the John Brown people just walking on the sidewalk for nothing, and put them in a van, let them out after the demonstration. The Klan does their, stupid Klan show, and they go home, and they're safe and sound, and all the John Brown people were thinking, oh crap, we failed. But then it cost the city of Houston $1 million to protect the KKK. And what they did a few weeks later, they're kind of scratching their heads like, this is not sustainable. They can't be shelling out, 'cause that's like, $5-10 million in today's money. And so they couldn't go against the First Amendment. So what they did, they updated the parade permits, the city laws about how to permit a parade. And it's like, and so it's across the board. Any group that's having a parade has to pay for their own security, and they have to pay for their own insurance. And it probably wouldn't pass the ACLU test, but it works. It's been working pretty good for 30 years or so now, because the astronauts and the rodeos and the art cars don't have to pay anything because they're not that expensive. But when it comes to protecting the KKK, and you got to hire 5 police forces to protect them, they don't have the $1 million to put up, so they don't march. And so it's using the state. It's kind of like a keto. I'm kind of more of an anarchist than anything else, but you're using the force against itself. You're letting it defeat itself. You just kind of like, you just got to show up. You got to get all your friends to show up. Bring anybody from Louisiana to show up. You got to make it too expensive for the city to protect them.
So we had 2 questions. You had a question and then a question. So can we take your question first?
So my question is about, I know you guys have some mixed opinions about bringing people over from different sides to support the socialism, anti-fascism movement. But I've seen a lot of Trump supporters who believe that he will help with the mining and coal industries, oil, things like that, agriculture. And I was wondering if y'all as a whole, or not as a whole, but individually, what your opinions are as to whether we can bring them to our side, if it's possible, if not.
So bringing former Trump supporters over to our side. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will say that, Republicans and Democrats are both factions of the bourgeoisie, and that there are people who voted for Trump who are potential allies, and there are people who voted for Hillary who are potential enemies. So how do we do it? I think that's a much more complicated question. But it's the same kind of movement building strategies and tactics or whatever that we've been employed with. So you're going to get a different answer from everybody else. But I guess I just kind of I wanted to throw that out there that
But also, Trump supporters are already becoming disillusioned because where are the jobs? They're not here. Where's the wall? It's not there, which is a good thing. So many working class people who voted for Trump for economic reasons, they're going to wind up hating his guts if he lasts 4 years. So I think that there's potential in people like that for sure. Do you?
I do. I don't think immediately.
You don't think what?
I don't think immediately, but I think there will be another kind of switch because people, used to be on the leftist side because they tended to get more protections for jobs and
right.
things like that.
It's a good question, and as I stated earlier, we have to win some of those people over. They say up to 10% of Bernie supporters voted for Trump. So there's a thing right there. So we have to. I mean, just look at the numbers. Hillary won by 3 million votes. You want to change the country, and you want to defeat the right, and then eventually overthrow capitalism. You've got to have hundreds of millions of people. And so you can't ignore these people. Yeah.
Right. So I've seen the traditionalist Workers' Party, fascist, making an appeal to the people, Appalachia, to the mining communities, and there's no reason they should be doing that, right? We can have, reasonable, materialist plans for mining communities because we know the coal industry is declining. These communities will be harmed, and there are reasonable plans for transitioning people away from mining jobs. Different plans for training and other reasonable solutions. And the left should be making these appeals and not letting people like the traditional workers try and step in. So there's reasonable solutions.
Can I jump in just a very quick question, which is that I've heard a lot tonight also the bread and butter demands and making material demands, and that this is how we'll, I guess, win over a lot of the Trump supporters. One of the things in the 30s was that, the communists did actually offer that. They did say we're going to end hunger and we're going to end starvation and homelessness. And yet the fascists still won. Because they, the idea is that they actually appealed to more. That, of course hunger and homelessness people want, but people also find themselves just devalued in capitalism. And so they look for something else as well. So I guess I'm wondering, is it really just that we have to do more material things as well? And I know that it can mean all sorts of things, but also in what way does just this ideologies, how do people find themselves in them? I mean, I guess I know I'm going back to the 4chan one, but it's why is this person finding themselves disaffected and being oh, well, maybe I actually do agree with these people? I don't think anyone's born a racist, but they kind of say, well, maybe I am bad or something. Maybe they don't think about it like that, but.
So what's your question?
I guess my question is that just saying like, oh, we'll give you more, like higher wages and more jobs, because of course that's what Donald Trump has offered. Right? Maybe
Take a stab at that.
let's take with some of the panelists.
Well, I mean, that's what trade unions are for. And Trump's not going to keep his promise. I mean, that's obvious he's saying that because he wants votes, and that's it. He's doing the same thing that capitalists have always done, make promises to everybody and only fulfill them to the rich. The Russian Revolution was not won because they said, we want socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was won by the masses. The Bolshevik Party won because it had three demands: land, peace, and bread. None of those are socialist demands, are they? All socialism does is it makes permanent bourgeois right. The right, to organize democracy, etc. All the rights that we have to struggle and die for in this country, a living wage, etc. And then we lose at the next election. Then we have to go back out in the streets and fight for it again. And then they take it away as soon as the Republicans win or the Democrats win. It goes back and forth. And we're a bunch of chumps, and they're sitting in River Oaks and their country club laughing about what stupid chumps we are. And until we break with that, we're gonna get what we deserve until we fight back, and we have to learn how to do it. And if I go out to the FLCL headquarters and say we need socialism, one or two. When I spoke at May Day at the FLCIO thing, I talked about neoliberalism. How right now, in the future we're going to have to get rid of neoliberalism and fight the neoliberalists. And afterwards, one of the leaders of the AFL-CIO came over to me and said, Bernard, I don't think anyone out here understands what a neoliberal is.
Wow.
So that, but he's one of the leaders in the FLCIO. That's what we're talking about: land, peace, and bread. What Bernie said. That's how we're going to change people that voted for Trump, and what actually happens and what they've been promised.
So I think what you were saying is, is there, besides these, material demands, is there like a cultural component that we can offer? Because the alt-right is all culture, right? And we know fascists love Wagner. Right? They think they're engaged, in some sort of so they think they're engaged in like some sort of cosmic battle. Can we offer something like that? Like I don't know what that would look like. I mean, maybe
us being cool,
right?
It's hard.
Freedom.
It hasn't happened in a long time.
Freedom, communism, freedom.
Yeah, that's fun for us, but I don't think the public at large really likes communist memes. That's not going to capture, their attention. That's not going to compete, with
Nazism, with fascism. I mean, we can't be that much worse than fascists.
That's not a cultural component to offer. Like there was recently, an article in the chat or something about, the insane clown posse, how they build up this, how they build up like this working class mythology, out of, the wreck Detroit, and they turned, working class devastation into, this mythology that's got nothing to do with material conditions. It's all fantasy. So I don't know. Is that?
Well, there are marches tomorrow, so we'll have to see. But I'll be paying very close attention to this to my struggle.
Yeah, so maybe ICP can be our brother.
Maybe. I'm not sure that he's quite culturally relevant enough. But we have to remember that these fascists also have an affinity for My Little Pony. So we all find strange bedfellows in strange times. So yeah, no, I think the cultural aspect of it, is indeed really important. We do have to kind of make ourselves more relevant and cool again, because the fascists kind of beat us to that punch, and that is an aspect. I think we talked about that recently, but I'm not necessarily sure that every person who becomes a fascist is necessarily kind of disaffected person that we're trying to win. Same thing with Democrats or Trump voters. We should be trying to win over the classic. That's what's important, not necessarily and also the most revolutionary and vulnerable sections of the class. You make no mistakes about that either. But we should be trying to win over the class and not necessarily disaffected liberals, Trump supporters, or anybody else who might also be categorically working class. But it's about them being working class, not necessarily all these other things. But yeah.
Michael, you had a question.
Yeah, let's see. That Trump got 61 million votes, sort of speaks for fascism in a way to me. So I would just make that as a comment, like you have the Convention of States and all kinds of people who really don't appear with swastikas on their faces and stuff like that. So I guess my question would be, that's sort of a comment, maybe get thought going in one direction, and it would be the isolated things like pulling down the statue in Boston, in the Boston 40,000 that showed up, and the different phenomena that we see, media phenomena, brings in the Antifa or Antifa. I don't know. Anybody have an expert way of saying it? Anyway, I thought we were going to talk a little bit about Antifa, so I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on just like if that's like something that's a distraction, and you all are very concrete tonight with a certain image of fascism, right? The skinheads and the Nazis and stuff like that, and the Confederate supporters. So I guess my question would be, can you see the Antifa working against the left?
That's a good question, because the media, I saw this article today that there has been more criticism of the anti-fascists than there has been of the alt-right or the neo-Nazis or whoever. And it really makes you think of the role of that the media plays in supporting the ruling class. However people want to fight fascism, go for it. But to go on and on and on about, the Antifas are so violent and they do this and they do that. I mean, as far as I understand, they're not even a structured organization. They just kind of show up and do their thing, right? So whatever they're doing, don't even compare them to the right. That pisses me off. But I do think the media has been playing a horrible role.
And you might mention the Black Panthers and how you see that as opposed to the Antifa movement.
What do you mean?
Well, they're both protecting.
Well, I mean, the Black Panther Party doesn't exist today.
Right. They're carrying guns. They're leftists or whatever.
That's the new Black Panther Party.
Well, that's the new Black Panther Party, which shouldn't even be using that name. The Black Panther Party had incredible community support, not because they were carrying guns, because they were feeding people. The kids in school today wouldn't get free breakfast. It wasn't for the Black Panther Party starting a free breakfast program. That came from the Panthers. So this new Black Panther Party is nothing.
So
the media or
I was just going to say the question was, is it possible for the Antifa to be an obstacle to the left?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, if I haven't made it clear, I guess my answer is kind of a nuanced yes, but also, we don't necessarily need to see the media as having succeeded at all in their negative portrayal of anti-fascists. I think a lot of average people have pushed back against it because it's raised that political question. Is it okay to punch Nazis in the face? Just kind of has thrown that out there and made it a national conversation. And I've been personally very, very, very surprised at the people that I've encountered that, aren't politicized people in my life who've come out and said, yeah, I'm about punching Nazis in the face. Now it seems about the time to be doing that. So I would say it's still, at the moment, it's still kind of politicizing people. I don't think that it will for much longer, though, because I think that, anti-fascism is kind of limited and impoverished a bit, you know. So.
Antifa is, like I said, it exists because the capitalist class will not defend people against fascism, and so someone has to do it. So it's a democratic, ground-up organization. It's loosely organized, but it also has different forms. There are sections of Antifa that are very, very organized and almost totally underground, and there's other groups that aren't, that are more anarchist. I know people in Antifa in two different types of groups, and they're quite different from each other. I think they play a positive role overall. I think that the main danger they have to be careful of is being infiltrated by police agents. As long as they deal with that and handle that, I don't think there's any problem. But the biggest failing of Antifa is it's almost all white, middle class. It does not have African Americans in it. I've never seen one. I'm sure there are some. But that's the biggest failing, and that's
You're talking about people with masks.
That's part of the failing. It's part of the failing of the left in general. Is that because capitalism gets its profits and exists because of the super exploitation over African Americans. That's how capitalism was built, and that's how they maintain their wealth to this day. They're the most oppressed people in the country, and if communists are not out attempting to recruit African Americans first and foremost, then they'll have an all-white organization, and they will never succeed at anything. And if I was African American and I went to a meeting of a Revolutionary Party and I walk in and I could tell you this last night I walked into one. I wouldn't call it a Revolutionary Party, but it was a Democratic Socialist group, 60 people, not a single African American. That's a failure. I don't care if they had 500 people in the room. They will never achieve anything without unifying on all these areas that the bourgeoisie splits us on.
Yeah, I don't know if that's really a failing that, a lot of Antifa or middle class, white people, the least oppressed people can take the most risks and they're the most arrestable. So it makes sense that they're taking more risks. So, but yeah, I think Antifa are definitely important.
It's the whole left. I mean, I've been a part of groups that really wanted to focus upon the racial composition of the group, and I agree that we should talk about the racial compositions of our groups. But that won't ever really happen with anti-fascists because they're all about obscuring their identities rather than having them out there. So it kind of begs the question of how you would even know. But also, in my experience, it's not a universally white thing. It's pretty much the same composition of the rest of the left, which is mostly white with non-white minority. But I mean that's the whole thing. That's the whole left. But I agree with you. That composition is really important, and also just the historical precedents, which I hope nobody's in a position to deny, of the black working class in America. Has always been there struggling the hardest.
So I have a question about tactics. So I'm just wondering about all of your feelings on the general effectiveness of doxing. We've seen that it has been successful in some cases, but it's also failed and ruined people's lives in other cases too. People that were seemingly innocent. So I'm just wondering about your general feelings towards it. I mean, I think, Gloria, you mentioned any way to fight anti-fascism is a great way. Would you say doxing is a great way to fight fascism?
Tell me what you mean by doxing.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. It's like leaking. When you mentioned before that some of the Nazis in Charlottesville got their identities taken.
Yeah, and then they lost their jobs and stuff like that.
So you leak their information, and then other people will go and take the responsibility of calling their work or notifying the public who these people are, where their address is, and so on and so forth.
I don't have any problem with that. Not at all.
Even if in some cases it fails, because in some cases it has failed, other people's lives are affected that are not.
It's failed in that you don't get the right person.
That's
you
right.
mean?
Yeah.
Oh well, I guess you have to be. I wouldn't do that unless I knew for sure.
Yeah, I guess I should more focus the question. Do you think that the benefits outweigh the costs of doxing? Because on the one hand, it spurs the right to do it more as well. Even like people that are not super high stakes, if they just see communism on your Facebook, you get doxxed. So
you can make the same argument about punching Nazis. You can punch the wrong person.
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to well, I don't know. I guess you can mistake a Nazi, but like if they're carrying a traditional working class.
I don't think
question,
have a moral weight.
Okay, so
whichever tactic works in whichever situation.
you had a response, and then once you're done, we'll just get sort of a closing remark from each of you.
For sure. On doxing, two thoughts. That it is a tactic, and sometimes tactics miss. As you just said, you don't stop using rifles just because you miss sometimes. And we should try very hard to make sure that we are not publishing information until we're damn sure who that is. Absolutely. The other thing is that I have seen online, I have a friend who basically surveils 4chan. And he said that after Charlottesville, he was actually seeing a lot of the alt-right, A, scared of being personally doxxed, B, realizing that doxing ruins lives and kind of not realizing that that's what they were doing and really rethinking that as their strategy. So it was effective in that it said, hey, the window goes both ways. You can see out and in. And they were like, oh shit, people can see us too. It was very sobering for a lot of people.
So since we're sort of getting to the limit right now, can I just get a closing remark from everybody? Just a final thought. Who wants to start, Gus?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I just kind of want to remind everybody to all these things, all these questions that you've asked and everything. I mean, not to shit on your event, but you'll probably understand. It doesn't matter as much when you raise it in this room, when you don't go into your workplaces and your school, your classrooms, and your neighborhood with your neighbors, and you raise these questions with them. And also, if you're in an organization, raise these within your organization and be honest about it, because we don't necessarily have to have movements about tailing fascists. We can have movements for ourselves. So, I guess kind of, yeah.
Just wanted to say that's why this is printed as a transcript, so you can bring it into your workplaces and everything. So there you go. Yes, we are in agreement. Yes.
I'm getting sleepy.
So this is long. You can just say, fight the man or something. Yeah.
I think everything's been said. I appreciate this being organized, and it's definitely an important topic. And I know after Charlottesville, I'm sure we're all horrified at what happened to Heather Heyer, but then when Takia Thompson the next week took the statue down, I'm like, yeah. So I just think the struggle continues, whether it's against fascism, capitalism, racism, sexism, whatever. The undocumented youth just got a blow when Trump said he was going to get rid of DACA. And one of the organizers, Cesar Espinosa, who I've known since he was a kid, he went to high school with my granddaughter. I asked him, well, what are you going to do? I mean, the dreamers have been attacked. He says, we're going to continue dreaming, and we're going to continue fighting. So I think that when we look at fascism, we have to have that attitude. And that's it. I'm sleepy.
Well, again, keep the eye on the prize. The fascists are a product of capitalism. Capitalism is the main enemy. Fight against capitalism, and those tactics and strategy are different than fighting against fascism. Be flexible in your tactics. And whatever you do, build unity and build broad movement. If anyone says you shouldn't unite with these people or these people, even if it's temporary, it's sectarianism, and you're only playing into the hands of the enemy. So unity and militant struggle, and keep your eye on the prize.
So I think violence and use of force matters. It can be used judiciously at the right place at the right time, and we've seen that even in small-scale confrontations like we've seen, it can be decisive. I also like to say that, groups in Houston that have been out with guns at protests. It's not productive to call them police provocateurs. We shouldn't call groups on the left provocateurs, unless we have real evidence, and I don't have that evidence, and I wouldn't like to make that accusation in public or in private. That doesn't mean I'm going to start bringing guns to protests, but so I think 10% of the coming struggle, 10% of that is going to be outgunning them, out-muscling them, using force. And 90% of it is going to be organizing the working class behind, movements, behind demands. And, an organized working class can be mobilized to fight fascism.
Okay, so give a round of applause for... Very nice.